Hello everybody, how's it going? Hope you're all well, welcome back to the channel. And a big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. More on that later. But I've been reading, shockingly, I know, I can read slowly. I've been rereading, actually, a book that I read on holiday last year called Same as Ever by Morgan Housel. Great book. And the penultimate chapter is called Trying Too Hard. And I want to share 3 sentiments from this chapter. Number 1. Complexity gives a comforting impression of control, while simplicity is hard to distinguish from cluelessness. Number 2, things you don't understand create a mystique around people who do. Understand, I feel like I should say at the end of that sentence, but hopefully you get the gist. Number 3, length is often the only thing that can signal effort and thoughtfulness. Why have I started a photography video by reading those sentiments? Good question. So I have spoken before on this channel, I think, about how I feel that often photography is made to sound more complicated than it actually is. And I think those sentiments give a good indication of why that is. And in short, I think it's because we're essentially incentivized to make things seem more complicated than they actually are. You know, if I, as a teacher of photography in this case, can make the delta between how much I know and how little you know seem massive, even if it's just perceived, then I stand a better chance of selling you a course about the exposure triangle, which does not need a course. And I think exposure is a pretty simple concept to wrap your head around, and I'm going to try and prove it today by talking about exposure, aperture, and shutter speed through a concept that I'm going to call the bare maximum. And hopefully I don't confuse myself in the process, because that wouldn't do my message much good. So, there are many instances in life where we operate within a working window. And if I was told, for instance, that the tyre pressures on my car needed to be between 30 and 32 psi, what I'd be inclined to do is aim for the middle. I'd set my tyres to 31 psi. Similarly, this ring that I wear on my finger tells me my optimum bedtime based on lots of different stats that it collects throughout the day. And the optimum bedtime is a window, the middle of which I'd aim for if I didn't have kids. But there are other instances in life where we very clearly don't aim for the middle of the working window. You know, if you're ordering wine at a restaurant, everybody knows to pick the second cheapest. And photography, or exposure at least, is a little bit like that. We don't want to aim for the middle of the working window. We want the bare maximum. Then I should explain what that is. So let's take a scene. This scene, for instance. And in this scene, like any other scene, there will be a spectrum of exposures that we can choose from, where we'll capture most, if not all, of the shadow detail and most, if not all, of the highlight detail. And that spectrum will obviously change dependent on the scene and your equipment, but broadly speaking, there is normally a spectrum. And let's say, for argument's sake, in this scene, that we can shoot 2 stops underexposed and still recover all of the shadow detail. Or we could shoot 2 stops overexposed and still recover all of the highlight detail. So we've got a window of 4 stops that we can shoot in to get a good image. And when you start out in photography, it stands to reason that you might think, right, well, I'll just shoot right in the middle of that window. Perfect. The problem with doing that is we're missing out on what I would call free light. And what I mean by free light is that we could have captured more light with no consequences, for the exposure at least. And the advantage of capturing more light is that it would have given us cleaner shadows while still retaining all of the highlight detail. And so on this spectrum of 4 stops, what we should do is expose more to the right. And as I say, I mentioned in the last video that I don't use histograms, but if you do use histograms, you'll be familiar with this concept of exposing to the right, basically having most pixels in your image mid-grey or lighter, so long as you're not clipping your highlights. So in terms of exposure, we want the maximum amount of light possible, but with no consequences. And the consequence obviously here would be losing highlight detail. So the bare maximum, we're just on the right side of being overexposed to the point where we'll lose detail in our highlights. Now for me, practically speaking in the field, what this means is that if I'm shooting with my Sony camera, I'll set my zebras to 100 plus, and I'll take my exposure just to the point where I'm starting to get some zebras in the very brightest part of the image. And if I've got just a few tiny little bits of zebra pattern, then I know that I'll definitely be able to recover that highlight detail still. But I also know that I'm maximizing my shadow detail. Now, whether or not I actually need that shadow detail or the highlight detail when it comes to editing the final image, a lot of the time I don't. But by shooting in this way, I give myself the most flexibility possible in post. Maximum amount of light, but only just. Bare maximum. Hope that makes sense. Let's talk about aperture, obviously one of the parameters that we can use to adjust our exposure. I have two goals with my aperture. Specifically, number one is to have everything in focus that I want in focus in my scene. Number two is to be somewhere around the optimal aperture for my lens. Most lenses, and this is a very broad comment, but most lenses don't perform best either wide open or shut all the way down. They perform best somewhere in the middle of their aperture range. And again, let's take this scene as an example. And let's say that for the sake of argument, I can have everything that I want in focus in this scene in focus at f8. And again, for the sake of argument, let's say that that is the optimal aperture for my lens in terms of sharpness across the frame. Now, those two things might also both hold true at f11. But in that instance, I'm not going to shoot at f11 because the consequence is that I'm cutting out light. And again, what we want is maximum light. And if I shoot at f11 versus f8 unnecessarily based on my aperture rules that I've set for myself, then again, I'm costing myself free light. And so what I want to do is shoot at the widest aperture possible to fulfill my two rules of having everything in focus that I want in focus and performing at a fairly optimal aperture for my lens. In short, what I want is the bare maximum aperture for my scene and for my lens. And much the same thing applies to shutter speed, another of the parameters that we can play around with to affect our exposure. And again, I have two parameters that I'm worried about when it comes to shutter speed. Number one, is my shutter speed fast enough to freeze all the motion that I want frozen in my scene? And number two, is my shutter speed fast enough to freeze any motion that I might be introducing through camera shake with my wobbly hands, especially if I've had a coffee or three. And let's say that in this instance, I can shoot at 100th of a second and freeze everything in the scene and also not risk any camera shake. And in that instance, it would make no sense for me to shoot at 3, 4, 500th of a second. Because again, what that's going to cost me is free light. And so again, what I want is for the shutter to be open and for the sensor to be exposed to light for the bare maximum amount of time possible to capture all the free light I can get while freezing the action and eliminating camera shake. Now, it's worth saying with regard to shutter speed and aperture that if you're shooting in quite a high-paced environment and if you haven't got time to be running tests on the aperture that you need or the shutter speed you need, then you might need to build in a buffer. You know, if you're doing street photography, it may well have been the case that you could have got away with 100th of a second for a shot, an f5.6. But if you're shooting in a high-paced environment, it's completely understandable that you might be shooting at 250th of a second and at f8. And in that instance, you've built in a buffer to make sure that your parameters don't fail when you haven't got time to assess your exact settings. But whenever you have, I find it useful to think about the bare maximum. How much free light can I gather without consequences that I'm not willing to accept? I don't know if I've made that sound simple or not, but if not, you can pick up my course on the exposure triangle for $99.99. I hope that's useful. I honestly don't know if it is. Fingers crossed. In any case, big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring the video. I have used Squarespace for 7 or 8 years, I think, for my business, and it's become integral to my business. My website is where I host my portfolio. It's where I talk about workshops. It's where I sell my books, my prints, my presets. And I do all of that without knowing a single line of code. And I think having a website where you can show your work in the way that you want to show it is a really important tool for all photographers. And so whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, I think it's well worth consideration. And you can try out Squarespace with a free trial by going to squarespace.com. And after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James to get 10% off your first purchase. And again, a big thank you to Squarespace for their continued support of the channel and for making great products. And I will see you next time when I promise I won't be talking about exposure. I certainly hope not. See you then.